Greetings from eastern Pennsylvania. Ever since the coronavirus pandemic started, I think I've spent more time in this little room than anywhere else. And yet, through technology, I've been blessed to be able to join people in other places in this country and also in different places globally. And I'm thrilled to be able to join you today through my computer. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate in this gathering of women leaders. When fire destroyed the Notre Dame Cathedral in April 2019, you didn't have to be French or Roman Catholic to grieve the loss. It was tragic. The cathedral spire collapsed. Fire damage to the structure and interior was extensive. In the aftermath, donors, skilled architects, computer technology experts, and construction workers joined forces in the daunting task of restoring this once breathtaking historic landmark. The goal was not to modernize, but to recover what architects had in mind when construction began in 1163. Imagine what the original architectural drawings would be worth today. As Christians, we face a similar challenge. We live in the ruins of a broken world. We are sifting through the rubble for scraps and clues to tell us what the world was supposed to be when it was first created, to tell us who we are and how we are to live in God's world. Deadly pandemics and natural disasters are destructive enough, but the worst damage is what human beings are doing to each other. And tragically, such harm is being inflicted inside the church. The past 7 years have been devastating here in the United States and reason for heavy grief that I feel all the time myself. White American evangelicalism is engulfed in a clergy sexual abuse crisis of epic proportions. Some of the best known, trusted leaders have been identified as perpetrators of these crimes. And many of them have worked to cover up the abuses that have been inflicted by their beloved colleagues. We have other forms of abuse that are flourishing inside the church: bullying, verbal, emotional, and spiritual abuse. And it's not an insider secret either. Social media and mainstream media headlines have trumpeted the abuse that is going on inside the church. The shocking scale and the who's who list of perpetrators has blindsided American evangelicals. It includes leading complementarians and egalitarian men. It's a total nightmare. Clergy leaders protecting perpetrators and re-abusing victims, treating them as liars, disbelieving their stories, and silencing them. They pressured them to forgive and forget what their abusers have done and move on. And rampant cover-ups are taking place inside the church. It is causing untold harm to children, to women, and plenty of men too. And the scandals haven't stopped. The church is not a safe place. And no best guess is going to put it back together as it should be. We are deeply broken. But here's the good news. We have the blueprints. We've had them all along, although in many ways we've set them to the side instead of keeping them front and center as a reference point for each step forward that we take. Two scholars, educational scholars of higher ed, have coined the expression threshold knowledge. Threshold knowledge is key information that changes everything that follows. And that's what these blueprints do for us. We find them in the opening 2 chapters of the Bible. The first words in the Bible give us vital threshold knowledge about God and about ourselves. It's the only pre-fall information that we have. And we read in the opening sentence that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Every other text of Scripture must be subjected to the scrutiny of these governing statements that follow. In Genesis 1 and 2, God makes 3 foundational statements that have to do with human beings, his sons and his daughters, from birth to death. And no one is excluded from what he says here. 3 things. The first is that we are God's image bearers. This is the decision the Godhead makes, to create human beings to be like God. It cements our identity, meaning, value, and mission in the world, and outranks every other human social system. It means that we are created to know our Creator and to emulate what we see in Him, to see the world through His eyes, to love what He loves, and to begin to do what He would have us do in this world. Comes with heavy responsibility. It is an implicit call to leadership. Human beings, both male and female, are called to rule and subdue God's creation. It is a call to rule outward over creation for the purposes of God, to rule and subdue and to be fruitful and multiply, which is often limited to procreation. It includes procreation, but it is also a call to the gospel, to multiply image bearers of the living God. God is our first assignment. We are to study Him, and we are to emulate what we see in His heart for the world. We are called to be rulers and who are subduing creation for the purposes of God, and to be fruitful and multiply. That's the first thing, and it's enough. It exalts us to the highest possible level, for we are created to be like God Himself and to fulfill His purposes in the world. But the second thing we learn about ourselves in Genesis 1 is that God calls His sons and daughters to do this together. He calls us to rule and subdue and to be fruitful and multiply as an alliance together that He blesses. The call for us to serve God as His image bearers together is not just, wouldn't it be nice if men and women would work together and get along better. It is that it is a kingdom strategy. This is the best way that God has designed for His purposes to advance in the world, for His sons and daughters to join forces for His purpose. If we miss the message of this kingdom strategy, Genesis 2 reinforces it. When God creates the female, He's just created the man. There's nothing wrong with the man. He is created at the pivotal point of God's creative activity. He is a masterpiece. He has just finished naming the animals That's the beginning of science. So God isn't fixing the man. He's reinforcing the need for this blessed alliance. And so when he looks at the man and says it is not good for the man to be alone, there are no parameters to that. Not good to be alone in the home or in the workplace or anywhere else. He doesn't specify it because it is a blanket statement. And this is what he needs, the Azer Connecto. The Connecto tells us that she is his match, that God is creating someone who is to the man as the North Pole is to the South Pole. She is his equal. And the Azer, when I first looked at this, scholars had done an inventory of the times that the word Azer is used as a noun in the Old Testament. It's used 21 times. 2 times for the woman in Genesis 2. 3 times for armies, when Israel is being overwhelmed by an attacking enemy and they want these nations to send their armies. They need reinforcements if they're not going to be defeated. And the 16 times that remain are used for God as the Azer of his people. Well, I went and looked up all those verses, and I discovered that in every single occurrence of the word Azer, military language occurs in the surrounding text. Send your armies. We need reinforcements. We're losing this battle. The 16 times that it's used for God, there's language like, God is our shield and defense. He's better than chariots and horses. He stands sentry watch over his people. And again in each verse, in each passage, this kind of language appeared. Israel, when they call for God to help them, aren't asking for incidental help. They need help that is significant. And I go back to the Genesis narrative and I realize that Eden is a war zone. An enemy is lurking, getting ready to attack, and it will be the most significant assault on humanity that ever has happened. And we know that the man is commanded to guard the garden. It's the same language as the angel guarding the garden with the sword when they're evicted. And male and female are called to rule and subdue, which means they will face opposition. And I concluded from that the Azer is a warrior. She's the Azer warrior to join the man in the battle for God's purposes on earth. So this is what we have when we look at the blueprints, that we are God's image bearers, that we are called to join our brothers in the battle for God's kingdom, that all of this is an implicit call to leadership, and that we are Azer warriors for God's purposes, and our brothers need us everywhere, in every context. If we miss this, if we overlook the blueprint, then everything that follows will be wildly off course. Any discussion of what it means to be male or female, to be human, begins here with the blueprints. Every other text of Scripture must be subjected to the scrutiny of the vision God casts for us in the beginning. So we have the blueprints, and as Azer warriors, we know that we belong in this battle. And so here we are, confronted with the disastrous brokenness of the Church of Jesus Christ, where there are deep wounds being inflicted, and lies are being covered up, and victims are being re-abused, and the pain and the trauma are enduring. We can't just look around at the rest of the world with a critical eye. We need to look at ourselves and scrutinize the deeply brokenness that is envisioned and embodied among us. The Genesis blueprint matters, and it starts with us. We are facing a pandemic, a global pandemic. and it's right under our noses in our own churches. We will never end this abuse pandemic if we don't learn what the coronavirus has taught us. If anything this pandemic has taught us is the battle will never be over until we identify and destroy the virus before it has a chance to infect anyone. And that applies to what's happening in the church. We can do all we can to deal with the allegations when they surface. But if we don't investigate and eliminate the problem of abuse at the root level, we are fighting a losing battle. If our theology creates a climate that is conducive to abuse in the first place, then we are fighting a losing battle. It's bad enough if we have a few scandals, but we have a systemic problem. My current project moved me into this crisis at the root level, and I didn't plan to do that. In 2015, I published a book called Maelstrom, Manhood Swept into the Currents of a Changing World. I wanted to tell the stories of men who appear in the biblical narratives about women that I had been studying. I wanted to tell their stories because these men embodied a different way of being male in God's world, a different gospel way of being male. These men led me to patriarchy. And the research that I did into what is happening to men and boys globally in today's world reinforced that trajectory. Patriarchy is not in the blueprints that God gave us in Genesis 1 and 2. It doesn't show up until Genesis 3. And that's where humanity's outward rule over creation is turned laterally, and now men will rule over women. And as it turns out, they will also rule over each other. When we keep reading in Genesis, one of the first things we should notice is that the Azor warrior recedes. A woman's value is no longer based on her call to image God in the world or to be an indispensable blessed part of this blessed alliance with her brothers. Everything changes, and now her value is gauged by the number of sons she can produce for her husband. In biblical narratives, the shift is monumental, and we begin to read the story of men. Genesis is the story of warring brothers, and patriarchy is at the center of their battles. Patriarchy's linchpin is primogeniture. Primogeniture privileges the oldest male in the family with power over everyone else in the family. And it bequeaths that power to a father's firstborn son. The irony in Genesis and texts that follow is that God doesn't play by patriarchal rules. In Genesis, he dismantles patriarchy, overriding patriarchy's preference for the firstborn. He prefers Abel, not Cain, chooses Isaac, not Ishmael, Jacob, not Esau, and Jacob chooses his son number 11, Joseph. But God chooses Judah, who is number 4. It goes on after that because God chooses Moses, Aaron's baby brother, and David, number 7. From my research, and there's a whole lot more to it than this, I concluded that we have made a big mistake when we conclude that patriarchy is the Bible's message. Jesus didn't come to give us a kinder, gentler patriarchy. And what I concluded is that Patriarchy is the cultural backdrop to the Bible's message. It's the perfect cultural backdrop that sets off in the sharpest relief the radical counter-cultural message of the gospel. It is a powerful hermeneutical tool that sets off in the sharpest relief the radical counter-cultural message of the Bible. It is a power tool in hermeneutics. More work remains to unearth it and the damage patriarchy has done in the world, but patriarchy will unleash the gospel potency of these Bible narratives. The stories of women in the Bible, when you put patriarchy in the backdrop where it belongs, they are so radical and countercultural, and we diminish them by just looking at them through an American Western lens. God has never given up on the blueprint He gave us in the beginning. And more work remains for us to dig into what God has said we are supposed to be. Repeatedly, all through Scripture, against the pressures and expectations of patriarchy, God mobilizes His Azer warrior daughters and works through them to advance His purposes for the world. Jesus came and died to recover that vision. The perfect Imago Dei, Jesus embodies the blueprint for us. We need to study Him, and He needs to be the center of who we are as God's image bearers. Jesus' dying prayer was that we would be brought to complete unity, to let the world know that the Father had sent Him, and that God loved us just as He loved Jesus. And when that happens, the world will know that Jesus has come and that His kingdom is not of this world. Join me in pursuing that vision and recovering that blueprint and being the Azer warriors God calls us to be. God bless you all.